The rain pattered steadily against the windows of the high-rise office building as a well-dressed woman in her early 40s gathered her belongings, getting ready to head home. She worked as a senior marketing executive at one of the city's top firms, living what many would consider a picture-perfect life in an exclusive neighborhood. The world had always seemed to bend to her will, shaped by her privileges and the assumptions she carried with her like a shield. That evening, her usual routine was disrupted when her car wouldn't start. After several frustrated attempts to turn the key in the ignition, she pulled out her phone and opened her rideshare app with an irritated sigh. The woman had rarely used such services, preferring her own vehicle or arranging private car services for special occasions. But tonight, she had little choice. As she waited in the lobby, she watched expensive cars pass by through the glass doors, imagining which one might be her ride. The app showed that her driver was just around the corner. She had specific expectations about who would show up, perhaps someone who reminded her of her neighbor or the valets at her country club. When a modest but well-maintained sedan pulled up, she checked the license plate number against her app. It matched. The driver was a black man in his mid-30s, wearing a neat polo shirt and sporting a warm, professional smile. The woman's body language shifted immediately. Her shoulders tensed, and her manicured fingers gripped her designer handbag more tightly. She hesitated at the entrance, pretending to check her phone while actually contemplating canceling the ride. But the rain was getting heavier, and her dinner reservations wouldn't wait. With visible reluctance, she stepped toward the car, her heels clicking against the pavement. The driver got out to open the door for her, a courteous gesture that she misinterpreted as threatening. She flinched slightly and quickly moved to open the back door herself, muttering something about not needing help. If the driver noticed her reaction, he maintained his professional composure, simply nodding and returning to his seat. Inside the car, the atmosphere grew thick with unspoken tension. The vehicle was immaculately clean, with a subtle air freshener creating a pleasant environment. Soft jazz played at a low volume through the speakers, the driver's attempt to make his passengers comfortable. But the woman saw these touches differently, her prejudices distorting every detail into something sinister. The driver attempted to ease the awkwardness with light conversation about the unexpected weather, mentioning how the rain had caught many people off guard that day. His voice was gentle and warm, with the kind of tone that usually put passengers at ease. He had been driving for over 10 years, earning a near-perfect rating from thousands of satisfied customers. But the woman responded with curt, one-word answers, making it clear she wasn't interested in conversation. She kept her eyes fixed on her phone, occasionally glancing up to check their route on the map, as if expecting to be taken somewhere other than her requested destination. When the driver had to slow down for a yellow light, she visibly tensed, her imagination spinning harmless actions into threats. The short journey felt endless to both occupants of the car. The driver focused on navigating the rain-slicked streets, maintaining his professionalism despite the palpable hostility emanating from the back seat. He had encountered such behavior before, the subtle and not-so-subtle signs of prejudice that colored his daily experiences. Each time, he chose to rise above it, refusing to let others' biases define him. Through the rain-streaked windows, the city lights blurred into a kaleidoscope of colors. Other cars passed by, their headlights creating momentary streams of brightness in the growing darkness. Inside the car, two people occupied the same space but lived in completely different realities, one shaped by years of unfounded fears and prejudices, the other by the daily challenge of facing those prejudices with dignity. What should have been a simple 15-minute ride was about to become a turning point in both their lives, though neither knew it yet. The woman's fingers hovered over her phone, her mind already crafting a narrative that had no basis in reality. The driver, meanwhile, simply hoped to complete the journey without incident, unaware that his next passenger would threaten everything he had worked for. As they approached their destination, the rain began to ease, but the storm brewing in the woman's mind was just beginning. She had already convinced herself of dangers that didn't exist, interpreting every routine action through a lens of prejudice. The security cameras silently recording the entire ride would later tell a very different story, one of a professional driver doing his job and a passenger creating fiction from fear. As they approached their destination, the rain began to ease, but the storm brewing in the woman's mind was just beginning. She had already convinced herself of dangers that didn't exist, interpreting every routine action through a lens of prejudice. The security cameras silently recording the entire ride would later tell a very different story, one of a professional driver doing his job and a passenger creating fiction from fear. The tension in the car grew thicker with each passing minute, like the heavy clouds gathering overhead. The driver kept his eyes on the road, his hands positioned perfectly at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. Years of experience had taught him how to handle difficult situations with grace, but tonight's passenger was testing the limits of his patience in ways he hadn't expected. In the back seat, the woman's designer handbag remained clutched tightly to her chest, her knuckles white from the grip. She had positioned herself as far to the left as possible, practically pressing against the door, as if trying to maintain maximum distance from the front seat. Every time the driver checked his mirrors, a routine safety measure, she interpreted it as him watching her. The radio played softly in the background, a jazz station the driver had chosen for its soothing qualities. The gentle saxophone solos usually helped create a peaceful atmosphere, but tonight they only highlighted the uncomfortable silence between the two people sharing this small space. "Would you prefer a different station?" the driver asked, his voice steady and professional. It was a simple question, the kind he'd asked thousands of times before. But the woman jumped slightly at the sound of his voice, as if she'd forgotten he could speak. "No," she snapped, then added under her breath, "just drive." The driver nodded, keeping his expression neutral despite the sting of her tone. Through the rearview mirror, he could see her furiously typing on her phone. His instincts told him she wasn't just sending casual text messages. After a decade of driving, he'd developed a sixth sense for trouble brewing. Outside, the city streets glistened with rain, reflecting the colorful neon signs of restaurants and shops still open for the evening crowd. The driver navigated through the traffic with expert precision, maintaining a smooth ride despite the wet conditions. Each turn was signaled well in advance, each stop gentle and controlled, evidence of his professionalism that the woman chose to ignore. At a red light, another car pulled up beside them. The woman in the passenger seat was laughing at something her driver had said. Both were smiling, enjoying a normal human interaction. The contrast with the atmosphere in this car couldn't have been starker. The driver thought about his family waiting at home, his elderly mother who had raised him alone, working multiple jobs to put him through school. He thought about the small business he was building on the side, using his driving income to fund his dreams. Each shift brought him closer to his goals, but moments like these reminded him of the obstacles some people would always place in his path. As they passed through different neighborhoods, the buildings grew more exclusive, the streets quieter. The woman began checking her phone map more frequently, though they were following the exact route she had requested. Every time they approached a turn, she leaned forward slightly, ready to object if they deviated even slightly from the path. "The GPS suggests taking the next right to avoid construction," the driver explained, breaking the silence again. He always made a point to communicate route changes clearly, knowing how important transparency was in his line of work. The woman's response was immediate and sharp. "No, stay on this road." Her voice trembled slightly, fear mixing with authority in a way that revealed more about her prejudices than she probably intended. The driver complied without comment, though he knew the construction would add several minutes to their journey. He'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. Instead, he focused on maintaining his composure, remembering the countless positive interactions he'd had with other passengers who saw him for who he was, a hard-working professional providing a valuable service. Through the windshield, he could see the rain starting to pick up again. Water droplets raced down the glass, creating patterns that reminded him of tears. How many times had he come home to his mother years ago, trying to explain why some people treated them differently? She had always told him to hold his head high, to let his work speak for itself. "Your dignity is not determined by their prejudice," she would say. The woman's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She answered it quickly, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. "I'll be there soon. Yes, I'm on my way. No, everything's not fine." She tried to keep her voice down, but in the confined space of the car, every word was clear. The driver could hear the fear in her voice, the trembling uncertainty that came from assumptions rather than reality. They were now in her neighborhood, where perfectly manicured lawns stretched out behind ornate gates. The houses grew larger, more spaced apart, each one a statement of success and privilege. The driver had been here many times before, dropping off other passengers who lived in these impressive homes. Some had been kind, others indifferent, but few had shown such obvious distrust. The dashboard camera continued its silent recording, capturing every moment of this tense journey. The small red light blinked steadily, unknown to the woman but a source of comfort to the driver. He'd installed it years ago, not just for safety but as a witness to the truth in situations exactly like this one. As they approached their final destination, the woman's anxiety seemed to peak. Her phone was now gripped as tightly as her purse, ready to be used as a weapon of a different kind. The driver could sense what was coming. He'd seen that look before, that mixture of fear and determination that often preceded false accusations. But he maintained his professionalism, knowing that his actions in these next few moments would be crucial. The luxury apartment building loomed ahead, its glass exterior reflecting the city lights like stars trapped in ice. As the car pulled up to the entrance, the woman's hand was already on the door handle, ready to escape. The driver hadn't even brought the vehicle to a complete stop when she pushed the door open, nearly hitting a passing pedestrian in her haste to exit. Rain was still falling lightly, creating small puddles on the polished concrete of the building's entrance. The doorman watched from his post, noting the unusual tension in the scene unfolding before him. He'd worked at this building for 15 years and knew most of the residents well enough to sense when something was off. The woman practically ran through the lobby, her heels clicking rapidly against the marble floor. She didn't look back, but her hands were shaking as she fumbled with her phone. The driver watched her disappear into the building, a heavy feeling settling in his stomach. He'd seen that look too many times before, the determination of someone about to do something they couldn't take back. Inside her apartment, the woman paced back and forth across her expensive hardwood floors. Her wet shoes left small marks that would normally bother her, but right now she was focused on something else. Her phone was in her hand, the rideshare app open to the trip summary page. The cursor blinked in the feedback section, waiting for her input. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen, crafting a story that existed only in her mind. She claimed the driver had made inappropriate comments throughout the ride, that he had watched her through the mirror in a threatening way, that he had tried to take a longer route to extend the trip. Each accusation was more serious than the last, each one completely disconnected from reality. But in her mind, she was convinced of her own story. The fear she had felt, fear based entirely on her own prejudices, had twisted every normal action into something sinister. Every routine check of the mirrors became a threatening glare. Every attempt at professional conversation became harassment. Every standard rap decision became an attempt to take advantage. The doorman, who had witnessed her hasty entrance, was now watching her through the lobby's security cameras as she stood by the elevators, still typing furiously on her phone. He'd seen the entire interaction with the driver, noted how the man had remained professional despite her obvious distress. Something didn't add up, and he made a mental note to save tonight's security footage. Back in his car, the driver sat quietly for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. He reached up and adjusted the dashboard camera slightly, ensuring it was still recording. Years of experience had taught him the importance of documentation. He had a feeling he would need it this time. His phone buzzed, another ride request. But before he could accept it, a notification from the rideshare company appeared. His heart sank as he read the message. Your account has been temporarily suspended pending an investigation into a serious complaint. Just like that, his main source of income was frozen. The job he had performed faithfully for years, maintaining a near-perfect rating, was suddenly in jeopardy because of one person's unfounded fears. He thought about his mother, about the bills that needed to be paid, about the small business he was trying to build. All of it now threatened by a false accusation. In her apartment, the woman was still adding details to her complaint. She described how unsafe she had felt, embellishing her account with fictional details that grew more elaborate with each paragraph. Her hands had stopped shaking now, replaced by a certain righteousness. In her mind, she was doing the right thing, protecting others from a danger that existed only in her imagination. The rideshare company's complaint system was designed to take all accusations seriously. Within minutes of her submission, an automated system had suspended the driver's account. No one had yet reviewed the actual evidence. No one had checked the dashboard camera footage. No one had spoken to the doorman who had witnessed the entire interaction. The system, designed to protect passengers, had become a weapon in the hands of prejudice. The driver decided to remain parked where he was for a few more minutes, documenting everything while it was fresh in his mind. He wrote down every detail of the ride, the exact route taken, the few words exchanged, the woman's behavior. His hands were steady as he typed, years of dealing with similar situations having taught him the importance of staying calm and methodical. Meanwhile, in the building's security office, the doorman was reviewing the footage from the external cameras. He saw nothing that matched what he had overheard about the complaint, just a professional driver doing his job and a passenger who seemed determined to find fault where none existed. He saved the footage, sensing it might become important later. The night wore on, but sleep would come to neither the accuser nor the accused. The woman sat in her luxury apartment, still convinced she had done the right thing, while the driver headed home to figure out how to fight another battle against prejudice. The truth lay somewhere in between, captured by cameras and witnesses, waiting to be discovered. The city continued its nighttime rhythm around them, unaware that a simple rideshare trip had just set in motion a chain of events that would force one person to confront their prejudices and another to fight for their reputation and livelihood. The rain had finally stopped, but the storm was just beginning. Early the next morning, the rideshare company's investigation team began their work. The office buzzed with activity as they pulled up the complaint file, one of dozens they would review that day. But something about this case caught their attention immediately: the driver's stellar record spanning over a decade of service. The lead investigator, a woman with 20 years of experience in conflict resolution, leaned back in her chair as she read through the complaint. The accusations were serious, but something didn't add up. She'd seen enough false complaints to recognize certain patterns, and this one raised several red flags. First, she pulled up the driver's history. The screen filled with statistics that told a compelling story. Over 15,000 rides completed, a 4.97-star average rating, countless positive reviews, and not a single serious complaint in his entire driving career. Comments from previous passengers painted a picture of a consummate professional who went above and beyond to ensure passenger comfort and safety. Check the dashboard camera footage, she instructed her team. This was standard procedure, but something in her voice suggested she expected to find something important. The tech team quickly accessed the video files from the previous night's ride. The footage was crystal clear, thanks to the driver's well-maintained equipment. The high-definition video showed everything: the woman's reluctant entry into the car, her obvious discomfort despite the driver's professional demeanor, the completely normal conversation attempts, and the standard route taken. Most importantly, it showed absolutely nothing to support the serious accusations made in the complaint. But the investigation team didn't stop there. They dug deeper, reviewing the woman's ride history. A pattern emerged that made several team members exchange knowing looks. This wasn't her first complaint, and all previous ones shared a disturbing commonality. They were all filed against drivers from minority backgrounds. Meanwhile, the driver was sitting at his kitchen table, staring at his phone. The suspension notification glared back at him, a digital reminder of how quickly prejudice could upend someone's life. His mother sat across from him, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. "We've been through worse," she reminded him softly. "Truth always finds its way to the light." The doorbell rang, startling them both. Outside stood the doorman from the luxury apartment building, still in his uniform after his night shift. He had used the driver's information from the rideshare app to track him down. "I saw what happened last night," he explained, handing over a USB drive. "I made copies of all the security footage. The external cameras caught everything from your arrival to her exit. You didn't do anything wrong, and I'm willing to testify to that." Back at the rideshare company's office, the investigation was taking an unexpected turn. Other drivers had begun coming forward with their own experiences of the woman's behavior. One shared screenshots of aggressive messages she had sent after learning his name. Another had a recording of her making discriminatory comments during a ride. The lead investigator compiled all the evidence into a comprehensive report. The dashboard camera footage, the building's security video, the woman's history of targeted complaints, and statements from other drivers. The pattern was undeniable and the evidence overwhelming. By early afternoon, the driver received a new notification. His account was being reactivated immediately, with a formal apology from the company. They had also added a note to their system about the woman's history of false complaints, ensuring that future accusations would be scrutinized more carefully. But the investigation team wasn't finished. They had a larger concern: how many other false complaints might be lurking in their system, filed by people whose prejudices led them to weaponize the complaint process. They began developing new protocols for identifying patterns of discriminatory behavior among users. The driver's phone started ringing with messages of support from other drivers who had heard about the incident. Many shared similar stories, creating an impromptu support network. What had started as one person's fight for justice was becoming a catalyst for broader change. In the building's management office, the doorman was meeting with his supervisors, sharing his concerns about the incident. The building prided itself on being an inclusive community, and they took the matter seriously. They decided to review their own policies about resident behavior and discrimination. The story began spreading through driver forums and social media, though names and specific details were kept private. It sparked important conversations about prejudice, false accusations, and the real-world impact of unchecked bias. Other rideshare companies took notice, beginning to examine their own complaint systems for potential abuse. As the day drew to a close, the driver sat with his mother again, sharing the news of his reinstatement. She smiled, unsurprised by the outcome, but relieved nonetheless. Sometimes, she said, the hardest battles bring the most important changes. The investigation had revealed more than just the truth about one incident. It had exposed systemic issues that needed addressing. The rideshare company began developing new training programs for their support team, teaching them to better identify and handle potentially discriminatory complaints. What had started as one woman's false accusation had sparked a chain reaction of positive changes. The truth hadn't just cleared one driver's name, it had opened eyes and started conversations that would help protect others from similar experiences in the future. The truth has a way of demanding to be heard, and on this particular morning, it arrived in the woman's email inbox with devastating clarity. The rideshare company had sent her a detailed message, complete with time-stamped video footage from multiple angles. Her hands trembled as she clicked the play button. The first video was from the dashboard camera. She watched herself enter the car, saw her own face twisted with unmistakable prejudice. The driver's professionalism was obvious: his gentle attempts at conversation, his careful attention to the road, his patience in the face of her obvious hostility. Nothing in the footage matched the story she had created in her complaint. Next came the building's security footage, showing the entire pickup and drop-off process from external cameras. The doorman had provided a statement describing what he'd witnessed, his words matter-of-fact but damning. The woman felt her carefully constructed narrative crumbling as she read his account of her behavior. She sank into her expensive office chair, the morning sun streaming through her corner office windows, suddenly feeling too bright, too exposing. Her computer screen displayed email after email from the rideshare company, each one revealing more evidence that contradicted her claims. They had uncovered her pattern of complaints against minority drivers, laid bare the prejudices she had tried to hide behind professional polish and social status. A knock at her office door startled her. Her company's HR director stood there, face grave. "We need to talk," she said quietly. Word had gotten out about the incident, and the company's reputation for diversity and inclusion was at stake. They couldn't ignore an executive who had been caught making false accusations based on racial prejudice. Meanwhile, across town, the driver was receiving very different news. The rideshare company had not only reinstated him, but had also created a new position for him, helping to develop driver protection policies and training programs. His experience would help shape how the company handled similar situations in the future. The woman's world continued to unravel throughout the day. Her social media was filling with messages from people who had heard about the incident. Former colleagues shared their own stories of witnessing her subtle prejudices over the years. A local news website was preparing to run a story about how rideshare companies were addressing discriminatory complaints, using her case as an anonymous example. In the building's lobby, the doorman was being praised by management for speaking up. His action had sparked a building-wide conversation about addressing discrimination. The resident association was organizing a community meeting to discuss making their luxury building truly welcoming to everyone, regardless of race or background. The woman sat alone in her apartment that evening, her phone buzzing with messages she was afraid to read. The truth she had tried to deny was staring her in the face, reflected in every screen and surface around her. She thought about her actions, really thought about them, perhaps for the first time in her life. She remembered her own grandmother's stories about facing discrimination as an immigrant decades ago. How had she become the very thing her family had once fought against? The realization hit her like a physical blow, bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. The driver's mother had always told him that education was the best response to ignorance. Now, his story was becoming part of that education. Other drivers were sharing similar experiences, creating a support network that turned individual incidents into a movement for change. The rideshare company was updating its policies, other companies were following suit, and a broader conversation about prejudice and false accusations was gaining momentum. Local community organizations reached out to the driver, asking him to speak about his experience. Though he was hesitant at first, he remembered his mother's words about turning challenges into opportunities for change. He agreed to share his story, keeping specific details private but using his experience to help others understand the impact of prejudice and false accusations. The woman faced her own turning point. Her company had placed her on administrative leave pending an investigation. Her colleagues' reactions ranged from disappointment to outright anger. The carefully constructed image she had maintained for years had shattered, leaving her to face the truth about herself. In the quiet of her apartment, she began writing an email she never thought she'd send. An apology to the driver, not asking for forgiveness but acknowledging the harm she had caused. She knew it wasn't enough, knew it couldn't undo her actions, but it was a start. The truth had emerged not just about one incident, but about the bigger picture of how prejudice operates in society. It showed how privilege can be weaponized, how systems designed for protection can be misused, and how standing up for truth can create ripples of change throughout a community. As the day ended, both the accuser and the accused found themselves at turning points in their lives. The driver was becoming a voice for positive change, while the woman was beginning the difficult journey of confronting her own prejudices. The truth had done more than clear one person's name, it had created an opportunity for real transformation. The consequences of that rainy night rippled through the community like waves in a pond. 1 week after the incident, the woman sat in her company's HR office, facing a panel of senior executives. The room felt colder than usual, the silence heavy with unspoken judgments. Her carefully built career, spanning 15 years of climbing the corporate ladder, now hung by a thread. "We've reviewed all the evidence," the HR director began, her voice firm but not unkind, including the rideshare company's investigation findings and the building security footage. "We've also received concerns from several of your colleagues about past incidents." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Our company has a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior." The woman's hands twisted in her lap as she listened to the list of consequences. Administrative leave would become indefinite suspension. Her leadership role in the diversity committee, an irony that wasn't lost on anyone, would be terminated. Her upcoming presentations at industry conferences were cancelled. Across town, the driver's story was having a different kind of impact. The rideshare company had asked him to help develop new driver protection protocols. He sat in a bright conference room, surrounded by executives who actually wanted to hear his voice, to learn from his experience. His decade of dealing with prejudice was being transformed into positive change. "We need to understand how to prevent this from happening to other drivers," the company's chief operating officer explained. "Your insight is invaluable." The driver shared his ideas about improving the complaint review process, implementing better screening for pattern behavior, and creating support systems for drivers facing discrimination. The local media had picked up the story, though names were kept private. A respected news channel was preparing a special report on discrimination in the sharing economy. Their producer had interviewed several drivers who came forward with similar experiences, turning one incident into a broader conversation about societal prejudice. Back at the luxury apartment building, change was also taking shape. The resident association had called an emergency meeting to address community standards. The doorman who had provided the security footage was invited to speak, his courage in coming forward praised as an example of doing the right thing. "We can't call ourselves a prestigious address if we tolerate prejudice," the building manager announced to the packed meeting room. New guidelines were being developed, making it clear that discriminatory behavior could result in lease termination. The woman's neighbors, many of whom had previously smiled politely at her in the elevator, now whispered about the incident in hushed tones. In her now quiet office, the woman sorted through her personal belongings, preparing to leave indefinitely. Photos of corporate events, awards from industry associations, certificates of achievement, they all seemed hollow now. A news alert popped up on her phone. Another company in the city was facing backlash over a similar incident. She realized she had become part of a cautionary tale. The driver's mother had invited neighbors over for dinner, a small celebration of her son's resilience. The kitchen was warm with the smell of home-cooked food and the sound of supportive conversations. "You turned something bad into something good," one neighbor said, passing a plate of fresh bread. "That takes real strength." Local community organizations began reaching out to both the driver and the rideshare company. They wanted to develop training programs about recognizing and addressing prejudice. The driver found himself invited to speak at community centers, schools, and corporate events. His story was becoming a tool for education and change. The woman's professional network, once vast and supportive, had grown eerily quiet. Former colleagues didn't return her calls. Speaking invitations were rescinded. The carefully curated image she had built over years had crumbled in a matter of days. She began to understand the true cost of letting prejudice guide her actions. In an unexpected turn, some good came from the incident. The rideshare company implemented new policies that became a model for other businesses. Driver protection measures were strengthened. Complaint systems were overhauled to better identify patterns of discriminatory behavior. Other companies in the industry started following suit. The building's security team received additional training on recognizing and documenting discriminatory incidents. The doorman's actions had shown how important it was to have clear protocols and the courage to follow them. "If you see something wrong," he told his colleagues during a training session, "you have to stand up for what's right." The woman's company used the incident as a catalyst for change, strengthening their diversity and inclusion programs. They brought in experts to conduct workshops, revised their policies, and made it clear that no position was too senior to be held accountable for discriminatory behavior. As weeks passed, the immediate storm began to settle, but the changes it brought remained. The driver continued his work on policy reform, turning a personal challenge into systematic change. His mother's words about truth finding its way to the light had proven prophetic. The incident became a reference point in discussions about prejudice and accountability. It showed how video evidence and digital records could expose truth, how individual actions could spark institutional change, and how standing up against discrimination could create ripples of positive impact throughout a community. 3 months after that rainy night, the small coffee shop on the corner of Main Street was unusually quiet. The morning rush had ended, leaving behind the gentle hum of coffee machines and soft jazz playing through hidden speakers. In a corner booth, 2 people sat facing each other, their untouched coffee cups creating small clouds of steam between them. The woman had aged somehow in these 3 months, though not in years. Her designer clothes were simpler now, her makeup lighter, as if she'd shed a layer of artificial protection. Her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup, drawing warmth from its surface as she gathered courage to speak. Across from her, the driver sat calmly, his presence as steady and professional as it had been that night in the car. He had agreed to this meeting after receiving her lengthy email, not an excuse-filled apology, but a genuine acknowledgement of her actions and their impact. Something in her words had felt different from the usual hollow apologies he'd heard before. "I've spent every day since then thinking about what I did," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not just to you, but to every driver I've ever judged unfairly." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "I found all my old complaints, read through them again. The pattern was so clear, but I had refused to see it." The driver listened quietly, remembering his mother's words about the importance of giving people space to grow. He had spent these months turning his experience into positive change, helping the rideshare company rebuild their complaint system from the ground up. His story had become part of their driver training program, though names and specific details remained private. My grandmother came to this country with nothing, the woman continued, her voice growing stronger. She faced discrimination every day. She taught me to stand up against prejudice, but somewhere along the way, I became the very thing she fought against. Tears threatened to fall, but she held them back. I lost sight of her lessons, lost sight of my own humanity. Outside the coffee shop, the city moved at its usual pace. People hurried past the windows, each carrying their own stories, their own prejudices, their own potential for change. Inside, two people who had started as symbols of a larger problem, the privileged accuser and the falsely accused, were becoming something else. Examples of how truth can lead to transformation. The woman spoke about her time away from work, about the soul-searching she'd been forced to do. She had started volunteering at a community center, listening to stories of immigrants and minorities, really listening for the first time. She'd enrolled in diversity and inclusion workshops, not as a corporate requirement, but as a personal commitment to change. "Your false accusation could have destroyed my life," the driver said finally, his voice firm but not angry. But instead, it became a catalyst for change, not just in the company's policies, but in how people think about prejudice and power. He told her about the new driver protection programs, the improved complaint review systems, the community discussions that had sprung from their encounter. The woman learned how her actions had sparked unexpected positive changes. The luxury apartment building had revamped its discrimination policies. Her former company had strengthened its commitment to inclusion, using her case as an anonymous example in training sessions. Other rideshare companies had adopted similar protection measures for their drivers. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she said, meeting his eyes for the first time. "What I did was unforgivable. But I am asking for a chance to show that people can change, that prejudice can be unlearned." Her voice grew stronger, more determined. "I want to use my experience to help others recognize and address their own biases." The driver shared stories from his years of driving, the daily microaggressions he'd faced, the strength he'd drawn from his mother's wisdom. He talked about turning pain into progress, about using difficult experiences as tools for education and change. His words carried no bitterness, only a deep understanding of human nature and its capacity for both harm and healing. As their coffee grew cold, they discussed ways to move forward. The woman had been invited to speak at diversity workshops, sharing her story as a warning about how privilege and prejudice can blind people to their own actions. The driver's input had helped create new industry standards for addressing discriminatory complaints. "My mother always says that true change starts with facing uncomfortable truths," the driver said as they prepared to leave. "You've taken the first step. The rest of the journey is up to you." Outside, the afternoon sun had broken through the clouds, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. They walked out together, no longer the accuser and the accused, but two people connected by a moment of prejudice that had transformed into an opportunity for growth. The woman headed toward her new job at a smaller company, one that had hired her knowing her story but believing in second chances. The driver returned to his work, not just as a driver now, but as an advocate for change in an industry that needed it. Their story became part of a larger conversation about prejudice, accountability, and the possibility of redemption. It showed how one incident, captured on camera and exposed by truth, could spark a chain reaction of positive change. Most importantly, it proved that while prejudice can be learned, it can also be unlearned, one honest conversation at a time.